Hello, my dear friends. You would never imagine how filthy the daily lives of Victorian women truly were beneath the polished surface of elegance. Hidden routines quietly spread sickness through wealthy homes, perfumes suffocated more than they refreshed, and beauty rituals drifted shockingly close to danger. These private habits reveal a world far stranger and darker than anything shown in paintings or history books. Tonight you'll step quietly into their rooms and witness what cleanliness really meant in their time. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If you were to step quietly into the dim rooms of a Victorian home in the dead of winter, you would find that the idea of daily bathing belonged more to imagination than reality. The seasons settled over the city like a heavy, unmoving veil, and with each passing day, the cold crept deeper into the walls and the bodies inside them. In those months, many women stopped bathing altogether, not out of neglect, but out of fear that a full wash would chill the body to the bone and invite sickness that could linger for weeks. Water drawn from the pump turned icy within minutes. Frost clung to the rim of basins, and the simple act of undressing felt like an act of punishment rather than care. So they adapted in the way people often do when comfort is scarce, choosing what seemed like the lesser discomfort and convincing themselves it was enough. Morning routines became rituals of avoidance. Instead of stepping into any kind of bath, women reached for bottles of scent, powders ground fine into fragrant dust, and small cloths dampened with spirits. A few swipes along the arms, a brisk rub at the neck, a hurried pat at the chest and under the stays, and they believed the sharpness of the alcohol or the sweetness of the perfume meant cleanliness. The room would fill with competing smells, heavy and artificial, drifting over the stale air that had not been changed since autumn. Even in silence, it was easy to tell that these habits masked more than they removed. The perfumes clung stubbornly to the skin, settling into the fabric of dresses and into the folds of corsets that were rarely loosened, let alone washed. Yet for many, this faint sting of spirits and powder felt safer than facing a basin of cold water in an unheated home. Layers of clothing were both a shield and a trap. Women dressed in thick wool, multiple petticoats, stiff stays, and long sleeves that brushed the wrists. Removing these layers entirely just to wash meant exposing the body to the cold air that seeped through windows, cracks, and chimney bricks. Each garment was a barrier not only against winter but also against the reality beneath. Linen chemises, meant to absorb sweat and oils, were often worn day after day because laundering them required hours of work, a fire hot enough to boil water, and hands already chapped from the cold. Over time, the cloth grew stiff, taking on the shape of the body as if it remembered every day it had been worn. The fibres trapped the powder and perfume, and sweat in a dull, muted scent that never quite disappeared. No matter how much fragrance was added, inside the quiet of these homes, routine replaced reflection. A woman might dab her wrists with eau de cologne while ignoring the chill that settled at her collarbones. She might tie her hair ribbon more tightly to keep loose strands from revealing how long it had been since water touched her skin. She might fold her chemise neatly at night, convincing herself that neatness meant cleanliness. The illusion was comforting because it was easy, and in a time when illness could travel through a community faster than news, any habit that seemed to reduce risk, even falsely, became deeply rooted. The air indoors grew heavy as days passed without fresh bathing. Rooms that looked orderly still held traces of the lives lived inside them, faint but unmistakable. Powder settled on vanities, perfume soaked into shawls, and the worn linen undergarments absorbed the humidity of breath and body. Women moved through their routines as if this were the natural order of winter, and in many ways, it was. Bathing had never been expected daily, not even weekly, and for some households, a full bath happened only a handful of times a year. What mattered most was that one appeared composed, scented, and presentable. Cleanliness became a performance the world could see, while the truth stayed hidden beneath fabric and fragrance. From a distance, the logic feels strange, yet in their world, it was ordinary. Fires were expensive to maintain, water difficult to heat, illness frighteningly common, and privacy limited. Powdering the skin and perfuming the body were quick solutions in lives that offered few easy choices, and the more these habits were repeated, the more natural they seemed. Even women who disliked the feeling of unwashed skin or stiff fabric learned to accept it as part of survival in the cold months. The body adjusted, or at least pretended to. It is easy now to picture the contrast between the elegance of Victorian portraits and the unseen reality behind them. Those painted faces looked serene, composed, gently lit, but no brush captured the layers of perfume that clung to their clothing or the linen undergarments worn far longer than comfort would suggest. The stillness of the portraits belied the heaviness of the routines that shaped daily life. And in winter, when cold dictated behaviour more than preference did, the idea of a refreshing bath dissolved into a quiet, distant luxury. As each day passed without water, the reliance on powders and scents deepened, softening the line between habit and necessity. Women rose each morning and moved through gestures they knew by heart, touching their bodies lightly with cloth and fragrance, while avoiding the shock of cold water as if it were something alive. This was not neglect but adaptation, the kind of compromise millions made in a world where comfort was a rare commodity, and survival meant adjusting expectations to meet reality. And in that adjustment, a kind of resignation formed, stitched into daily life as tightly as a thread holds fabric together. The stillness of those winters made these routines feel inevitable, and as the days settled into patterns of scent and powder, another aspect of Victorian hygiene quietly emerged, waiting to be uncovered. Some practices, hidden deeper beneath the layers of fabric and fear, would reveal far stranger truths. Under the dim light of a small Victorian washroom, the wooden tub stood as a permanent fixture, waiting in its corner with a kind of heavy resignation, because in most households it was never truly emptied after each person stepped out. Families relied on a single basin, its boards darkened by years of moisture, soap suds, and the slow absorption of whatever the water carried. It was meant to be practical, meant to save time, fuel, and effort, and for many families, there was simply no other option. Bathing began with the person who needed it most or the one who insisted first, and as the water settled, each member joined in sequence, not questioning the routine that shaped their evenings. The warmth faded quickly in the winter air, the steam thinning until only a faint mist clung to the rim, but still they lined up, each knowing that the water would only grow murkier with every body lowered into it. For the first bather, the experience resembled something close to comfort. The water was warm enough to soften the skin and loosen the day's sweat from the fabric of clothing that had been worn too long. Soap foam lingered around the edges, pale and harmless, drifting lazily as the body moved. But the clarity disappeared fast. Once the second person stepped in, the water changed, the soap mixed with the residue left behind, and soon thin streaks floated in slow circles along the surface, bits of lint, hair loosened from combs, and the day's grime gathered together in soft swirls that drifted from one end of the tub to the other. No one commented. They accepted it silently, the way people accept the creaking of old floors or the draft beneath a door, because there was no expectation that the bath should be anything more. By the third or fourth person, the bath bore almost no resemblance to the clear water first poured into the tub. It turned cloudy, then opaque, until the bottom could no longer be seen, the darkness pooling in the deepest part like a forgotten shadow. The water gained a weight to it, the kind that clung to skin even after stepping out, leaving a film that felt neither clean nor wholly unpleasant, simply familiar. Women sank into this mixture out of necessity, lowering themselves carefully as if moving slowly could keep the water from revealing its unpleasant warmth. The scent of old soap mingled with sweat, with oils lifted from the skin, with the faint mineral smell of wood dampened too many times. Even breathing carried the memory of everyone who had bathed before. The last person in line endured the worst of it, a truth acknowledged but never spoken aloud. Children often took this place, not by choice but by expectation, their small bodies disappearing beneath a surface that no longer held any trace of clarity. They sat still, aware of the thin flakes drifting around them, the lingering heat long replaced by something lukewarm and tired. For them, bathing became less an act of cleansing than a ritual of participation, a reminder that cleanliness relied more on effort than on results. The room itself absorbed everything. The moisture clung to the walls. The wooden boards softened in the corners, and each drop that spilled over the rim left behind a faint outline as it dried. Maintaining the tub required labour that many avoided unless necessary. Scrubbing the wood meant bending over the heavy container, hands chafed by cold water and stiff brushes. Heating enough water to rinse it properly meant feeding the stove with coal or wood that families preferred to save for cooking and warmth. So the tub often remained coated with a thin, invisible film between uses. The fibres of the wood darkened over time, absorbing the scents and residues from dozens of baths, creating a surface that felt permanently damp. When touched, the boards yielded slightly, worn smooth by years of soap and skin. It was a small mercy that no one expected perfection. The tub existed to serve, and it did so with a kind of quiet endurance. The ritual of shared bathing seeped into the rhythm of daily life. Women often went last, not because they chose to, but because the demands of the household placed them at the end. They lifted the skirts of their heavy dresses, tied them loosely out of the way, and settled into the water with a steady exhale, knowing the warmth had already fled. The mixture of old soap and cooled water brushed against their skin, leaving behind faint traces of the day that no amount of rinsing could entirely remove. They emerged with hair dampened at the ends, skin reddened from the cold air, and clothing that quickly absorbed the moisture rising from the tub. Yet they carried on, stepping through dim corridors with the quiet acceptance that defined much of their existence. These wooden baths were not symbols of neglect, though they looked weary and stained. They were reminders of a time when comfort was rationed and water was precious, when cleanliness depended not on freshness but on shared routine. The tub waited in its corner each day, absorbing the weight of the family's needs, holding every bath within its boards long after the water drained. Its purpose was both practical and symbolic, embodying the compromises Victorian women made in their daily pursuit of managing households that demanded too much and returned too little. Even in its most unappealing state, the tub remained indispensable, a silent witness to the intimate, unglamorous realities of cleanliness in an era obsessed with appearances. The worn surface of that wooden tub reveals how far practicality outweighed comfort in Victorian homes. And as we move deeper into their private routines, another practice sits quietly in the background, waiting to be noticed. Some habits, lingering beneath layers of soap and custom, conceal a truth far stranger than the water they left behind. The hair of a Victorian woman carried the weight of routine, expectation, and quiet discomfort, settling around her shoulders like a constant reminder of a world where washing was more feared than filth itself. In many homes, the idea of wetting the scalp was treated cautiously, almost with suspicion, because cold water against the head was believed to invite illness that could linger through the long winters and weaken the body in ways difficult to reverse. Mothers repeated these warnings until they became woven into habit, and daughters learned early that soaking their hair too often was an unnecessary risk. As a result, days turned into weeks, while the hair remained untouched by water, gathering the faint sheen of oils that grew heavier as time passed, settling along the strands until they felt thicker than they appeared. Instead of washing, women relied on brushing, a method that seemed gentle and refined but could only shift the residue from one place to another. Each morning began with long, repetitive strokes as the brush travelled from scalp to end, smoothing the surface while coaxing natural oils to distribute evenly. The bristles filled slowly with loose strands and pale dust shaken free from the previous day. This quiet ritual offered comfort, its predictability soothing, even as the scent rising from the hair revealed that cleanliness was only a distant impression. The brushing softened tangles and restored a certain shine, giving the appearance of health that matched the era's expectations. But beneath that surface lay a mixture of sweat, old powders, and the stale air of tightly closed rooms. Perfumed powders became a familiar companion, settling into parted hair like a pale mist. Women sprinkled them along the scalp, lifting sections carefully so the powder could reach the roots, then brushing again until the scent overtook whatever lingered beneath. These powders were cool and dry, giving the illusion of freshness while clinging tightly to every strand. They masked the oils just long enough to carry a woman through her social hours, leaving faint traces on combs, pillows, and the collars of dresses. Their fragrances varied from sweet floral notes to the sharpness of herbal mixtures, each chosen to counter the natural odour that grew when washing was postponed for weeks at a time. Over the course of a day, the powder mixed with oils and became heavier, gathering near the scalp where warmth encouraged it to settle. The belief that washing the head threatened one's health shaped not only personal habits, but also the rhythms of daily life. Women avoided stepping too close to cold air after brushing, shielding their heads with shawls when drafts crept through the home. They slept with their hair braided or pinned, the arrangement intended to protect it from tangling but also to preserve the powder resting within. Bedsheets absorbed the scent, the mixture of perfume and perspiration sinking into the fabric until the room held a faint, unchanging odour that hovered even after windows were briefly opened. In winter months, these windows remained closed for long stretches, trapping the air inside until it thickened with the presence of every person in the household. Social appearances demanded a certain polish, and hair was often the first feature people noticed. Women styled their unwashed strands into elaborate shapes pinned with combs and ribbons, smoothing the surface carefully so no one could see the heaviness beneath. The tension from the pins held the hair tightly in place, sometimes pulling at the scalp until it grew tender. Yet the appearance of neatness mattered more than comfort. Even as oils gathered at the roots and powder formed a thin layer near the temples, the final result looked orderly enough to satisfy the expectations of those who saw only the outside. The scent of perfume drifted with each movement, creating a soft cloud that suggested cleanliness where there was little. As days turned quietly into weeks, the hair absorbed the rhythms of life inside the Victorian home. It carried the smell of kitchens where food simmered for hours, the lingering smoke of coal fires, the faint dust rising from carpets and fabrics that were rarely shaken outdoors. Each brushstroke blended these scents, weaving them into a subtle, persistent reminder of domestic routine. Water might have removed them, but the risk seemed too great, the warnings too deeply rooted in the culture to ignore. Instead, women accepted these traces as part of themselves, adjusting ribbons and smoothing stray strands in the mirror with a calm resignation. The scalp, confined beneath layers of powder and oil, grew sensitive over time. It warmed beneath bonnets and heavy hairpins, creating a dampness that could not escape. When women finally allowed their hair to be washed, the sensation of water touching the skin felt almost foreign. The strands grew heavier before they grew lighter, releasing weeks of residue into the basin in cloudy swirls that revealed just how long the build-up had been accumulating. But this happened rarely, often far less than health or comfort would have required. In the rhythm of Victorian life, the idea of frequent washing was simply not practical or accepted. The fear of illness outweighed the discomfort of dirt, and the illusion of fragrance outweighed the truth beneath it. Still, the routines continued. Each morning, the brush moved through the hair with practiced patience. Each evening, the powder settled into its familiar place. The women of the era carried their unwashed hair through bustling markets, quiet parlours, and dimly lit rooms, presenting a polished exterior supported by a fragile foundation of habit and belief. Their hair revealed more than they realized a reflection of the era's anxieties, its limitations, and the sacrifices made to maintain the appearance of refinement. Beneath the ribbons and smooth surfaces lay the quiet story of lives shaped by fear, practicality, and the persistent weight of expectation. The carefully brushed and perfumed hair masked truths that water was rarely allowed to touch. And as these unwashed routines settled deeper into daily life, another custom waited nearby, shaped by the same fear and the same desire for appearances. Certain habits, resting quietly beneath the layers of powder and routine, reveal far more discomfort than the era ever admitted. Using urine as a cleansing agent existed quietly beneath the polished surface of Victorian refinement, forming one of the era's most concealed and unsettling habits. Within the privacy of bedrooms lit only by a small lamp or the fading glow of a coal fire, some women turned to a substance that seemed impossibly far from the elegance they displayed in public. The belief rested on the idea that ammonia, formed naturally as urine aged, possessed the power to whiten the skin, close blemishes, and purify the face in ways ordinary washing could not. In a world where pale skin symbolized status and delicacy, the promise of a lighter complexion was enough to make this strange ritual feel, to them, almost logical. And so, despite its discomfort, the habit persisted quietly behind closed doors. The process began with preparation, carried out with careful discretion. A small ceramic container was kept hidden beneath a dressing table, or stored among jars of powders and oils, indistinguishable from other cosmetics unless opened. Some women used their own urine, convinced that freshness offered the most benefit. Others sought the urine of cows, believing it milder, less odorous, somehow gentler in its effect. Regardless of the source, the liquid was handled with a level of calm practicality that seemed startling now, as though it were no different from rosewater or scented tonics. The stillness of the room absorbed the action, leaving no trace except the faint, sharp scent that lingered once the lid was removed. Applying the liquid required slow, deliberate movements. A cloth, soft from repeated use, was dipped lightly into the container until it absorbed just enough to moisten the fibres. Women dabbed the mixture along their cheeks, across the forehead, and down the jawline, each touch releasing the unmistakable smell that clung to the air like a thin veil. Some held their breath, others had grown accustomed to the odour through repetition. As the liquid dried, the skin tightened slightly, creating a mild stiffness that they interpreted as proof of its effectiveness. The room grew quiet during these moments, filled only with the faint scratch of fabric against skin and the distant hum of the house settling for the night. For those who believed deeply in the procedure, the next step extended through the hours of sleep. The residue left on the skin remained there until morning, trapped beneath blankets that absorbed the scent, seeping into pillows already familiar with the fragrances of perfume, powder, and hair oil. Women drifted into uneasy rest, aware of the faint dampness along their faces, but trusting that the discomfort would eventually reward them with a brighter complexion. When morning arrived, they washed the skin lightly with cool water, careful not to scrub too hard, convinced that removing too much would undo the night's work. The scent did not disappear entirely, settling into the fabric of the bedding and into the morning air of the room. The secrecy surrounding this ritual was nearly absolute. Women did not speak of it to friends, sisters, or even their closest confidants. The knowledge passed quietly through whispers, old household remedies, or private experimentation. Even those who practiced it preferred not to acknowledge it aloud. The contradiction between public elegance and private discomfort was too great, and the fear of judgment too heavy. Appearance mattered enormously in Victorian society. Yet many of the methods used to achieve that appearance lived in shadow. This was one of the shadows most carefully protected. Despite its hidden nature, the habit grew from the same pressures that shaped countless other routines in the era. The desire for flawless skin, for a pale and even complexion, for a face unmarked by sunlight or stress, created a silent desperation. Powder alone could not conceal every imperfection, and many women turned to whatever treatments promised even a small improvement. The lack of medical knowledge only strengthened the belief. If ammonia could whiten linens or brighten fabrics, surely it could brighten the skin as well. Logic in those years often rested not on science, but on observation and hope, and both pointed them toward this strange, unsettling ritual. Rooms that held these secret practices carried faint reminders long after the cloths were rinsed and the containers closed. A subtle sharpness in the air, a note that mingled with powders and oils, hinted at what had taken place even when no one spoke of it. The bedding, cleaned less frequently than needed, absorbed the presence of the habit and released it slowly through the night. Yet the women who performed the ritual learned to ignore these sensations, focusing instead on the small changes they believed they saw in the mirror each morning. The skin appeared smoother under the dim light. The tone seemed slightly lighter. These impressions, once formed, were enough to sustain the practice. In this ritual, the contrast between appearance and reality reached one of its most striking forms. Victorian women moved through daylight hours wrapped in elegance, their faces powdered, their hair arranged carefully, their clothing immaculate. Yet the night revealed a truth far removed from the image they presented. They endured discomfort, odour, and secrecy in pursuit of beauty defined by standards neither fair nor attainable. And through it all, the hidden jar remained at the back of the table, waiting for the quiet moment when it would once again be opened. The quiet secrecy of applying such a mixture reveals how deeply beauty shaped the private lives of Victorian women, and as we move further into the rituals that shaped their days and nights, another habit emerges from that same desperation for appearance. Various practices, when lifted gently from the shadows of these dim rooms, expose a far more troubling devotion to cleanliness than their society ever admitted. Linen undergarments formed the first layer beneath a Victorian woman's carefully arranged clothing, yet they were also the garments most likely to be worn long past the point of comfort. Washing linen by hand demanded time, strength, and resources that many households could not spare daily. And so the decision not to change these pieces often was less a sign of neglect than a reflection of the hard practicality that shaped everyday life. The fabric, soft and breathable when freshly cleaned, gradually absorbed everything the body released throughout long days spent moving through cold streets, warm kitchens, and dim living spaces. Even so, women folded themselves into the same undergarments again each morning with quiet acceptance, knowing the cloth would grow heavier with each passing hour, yet having little choice but to continue wearing it. The routine began early, as women dressed by the faint light filtering through small windows or by the glow of a lantern. Linen chemises, drawers, and petticoat linings were pulled on first, resting directly against the skin, forming a barrier between the body and the layers of wool, cotton, or corsetry worn above. These pieces were never intended for display, and perhaps for that reason, they were granted only the amount of care that survival allowed. Laundering them required heating water, mixing soaps, scrubbing by hand, wringing out the pieces, and hanging them to dry in homes where warmth was scarce. Each step consumed time that women rarely had, especially those responsible for tending families, maintaining homes, and managing long days of labour. So the linen remained against the skin for days at a time, adjusting quietly to the rhythms of the body. By the second or third day, the cloth began to hold faint patterns of use, the gentle shadows left behind by sweat, powders applied in place of washing, and the natural oils that accumulated beneath heavy clothing. These marks did not always show, but the texture changed subtly, the fabric stiffening in some areas while softening in others. The scent shifted as well, becoming a muted mix of perfume trapped in folds, perspiration absorbed deep into the threads, and the lingering smell of the rooms through which the wearer moved. Women learned to ignore these changes the way one learns to ignore the creaking of old floors or the persistent chill beneath a door. Cleanliness, in their world, did not depend on the freshness of the fabric but on the neatness of appearance. When linen was worn for nearly a week, it carried far more than sweat alone. Days of movement layered dust from streets, traces of hair oil, residues of powders used on the face, and the natural musk of a body working through long hours. During menstruation, the garments absorbed even more, bearing stains that could not be removed easily with cold water or limited soap. Women folded these pieces discreetly, hiding them between layers of skirts or within aprons, hoping the fabric would hold until it could be washed properly. In many homes, these undergarments were dried near fireplaces, where the heat masked faint odours without truly cleansing the cloth. They returned to the body as soon as they were dry enough to wear. The pressure to appear presentable in public made these private discomforts entirely invisible. Women moved through markets, parlours, and drawing rooms with their outer garments pristine and carefully arranged, while beneath those fabrics the linen clung closely, carrying the untold story of each day. Corsets pressed the undergarments tightly against the skin, reducing airflow and trapping warmth until the cloth felt almost fused to the body. Yet removing them for frequent washing was simply impractical. The routines of Victorian households demanded efficiency above comfort, and so women accepted the way the linen darkened along seams, absorbed scents from their surroundings, and grew heavier with each day's wear. Nights offered little relief. Many women slept in the same undergarments they wore during the day, the fabric warming beneath blankets before cooling again in the morning air. Sheets captured the scent of the garments, adding to the layered odours of bedrooms where windows were rarely opened during cold seasons. Pillows and quilts absorbed the same mixture, creating an environment where the smell of lived-in linen blended seamlessly with the faint aromas of coal smoke and perfumed hair oils. The cycle continued unbroken, each morning returning women to the same garments, slightly altered but still functional. This persistence reflected the broader realities of Victorian life, where cleanliness was often more of an impression than a truth. A freshly powdered face, neatly arranged hair, and spotless outer garments created a convincing illusion, even when the cloth resting against the skin had not been washed for days. Most people understood the difficulty of laundering linen frequently, so these habits remained largely unspoken, shared quietly by women who recognized in one another the silent challenges of maintaining a household. The undergarments, though unseen, bore witness to the hidden burdens they carried. Only at the end of a long week, when the scent became too insistent or when stains grew too visible, did many women finally gather the strength to scrub their linen by hand. The process left their knuckles reddened from cold water, their arms tired from wringing out the heavy fabric. When the garments were finally hung to dry, they fluttered slightly in whatever breeze the home allowed, pale reminders of the work required to maintain even the most basic form of cleanliness. Once dry, the linen returned to the body like something renewed, beginning the slow process of absorbing another week's worth of life. Worn linen carried the quiet truths of everyday survival, reminding us how much effort went unseen beneath the layers of Victorian clothing. And as these private routines settled into the fabric of daily life, another practice emerged, shaped by the same balance of necessity and discomfort. Hidden rituals, resting close to the skin, reveal far more about Victorian cleanliness than their polished exteriors ever suggested. Cleansing the face became one of the few consistent rituals Victorian women practiced. Yet even this small gesture carried its own quiet limitations. Thick layers of powder, rouge, and creams shaped the appearance expected in public. and removing just enough of it each night required precision rather than thoroughness. A soft cloth, slightly dampened, was all many women used, pressing lightly along the cheeks and forehead until the most visible traces of makeup lifted away. The cloth absorbed the residue in faint smudges, leaving behind a surface that appeared refreshed under low lamplight. But this attention rarely extended beyond the face itself. The neck, the ears, and the nape remained untouched, shaded areas where powder settled throughout the day, and sweat collected beneath heavy fabrics and tight hairstyles. The neck bore the first signs of neglect. Corsets rose high enough to trap warmth against the skin, and the stiff collars of dresses rubbed gently along the throat as women moved, leaving behind a faint mix of perspiration and powder. Yet when evening arrived, and the cloth passed over the face, the neck remained outside the ritual. Women believed that removing makeup from the most visible parts was sufficient, and with exhaustion settling over long days, few felt compelled to cleanse areas the public rarely saw. As a result, the skin beneath the chin held a quiet tackiness, a thin layer formed from hours of movement and the constant press of fabric. The clothes used each night never reached this place, leaving the residue to deepen slowly. The ears collected their own version of the day's accumulation. Powder drifted into their curves as women applied cosmetics each morning, settling near the folds where it remained unnoticed. Earrings, often worn from dawn until late into the evening, trapped heat behind them, encouraging faint moisture to gather. When the jewellery was removed at night, the skin beneath sometimes revealed a pale imprint, softened by the mixture of sweat and powder that had been held in place for hours. Yet women rarely examined their ears closely. The ritual of cleansing focused almost exclusively on the face, where appearance mattered most, and the hidden areas of the head received only fleeting attention. The nape of the neck carried perhaps the heaviest burden. Hairpins held elaborate hairstyles tightly in place, restricting airflow and trapping warmth where strands lay flat against the skin. Throughout the day, sweat gathered beneath the hair, mixing with powders that drifted downward and settled into a faint, persistent layer. When night came, women loosened their hair with relief, but the cloth that dabbed the face never travelled to the neck. The skin remained coated, its surface slightly rough from residue and occasionally carrying the faint imprint of jewellery worn all day. In the dim light of bedrooms, the nape became a place forgotten, not out of disregard, but out of habit, shaped by the belief that cleansing needed only to restore the face presented to the world. Removing jewellery revealed the stronger effects of this limited routine. Necklaces left faint bands across the skin, pale outlines of the day etched in powder and sweat. Earrings, once loosened, exposed small patches of dampness that smelled faintly metallic and sour, a mixture intensified by the warmth trapped behind them. Women wiped them quickly with fingers or a cloth, but rarely addressed the underlying build-up. The combination of makeup, perspiration, and tightly fastened accessories created a quiet layer beneath the elegance they displayed, a reminder that appearance often overshadowed comfort. Despite these overlooked areas, the nightly routine continued without disruption. Women dipped their cloths into modest basins, wrung them out carefully, and pressed them gently across the forehead, cheeks, and chin, satisfied by the sensation of a surface made momentarily clean. The untouched parts of the body remained hidden beneath nightgowns and blankets, carrying the residue into the next day, blending gradually with each morning's fresh powder. These forgotten places did not demand attention because they were not meant to be seen. Cleanliness, in the Victorian sense, relied more on perception than on completeness. As days passed in quiet repetition, the build-up along the neck and ears changed subtly. The scent deepened, a mixture of perfume trapped beneath layers and the natural musk of the skin. Fabrics absorbed these odours slowly, creating an atmosphere within the home that felt lived in yet never fully aired out. Women grew accustomed to the sensation, noticing only the freshness of the face after the evening's wipe. Meanwhile, The rest of the skin bore the quiet imprint of routines that prioritized what was most visible. It was a rhythm shaped by practicality and by the delicate balance between effort and expectation. Victorian women carried the weight of beauty standards that required constant maintenance, yet the resources and time available to them limited how thoroughly they could care for their bodies. The result was a pattern of partial cleansing that felt both sufficient and inevitable. The surface that mattered most was the one facing outward, and everything else slipped beneath the folds of daily life. This narrow focus on the face reveals how deeply appearance dictated the boundaries of cleanliness in Victorian routines, and as these habits settled quietly into their evenings, another overlooked practice surfaced from the same desire to maintain a fragile sense of order. Forgotten details, left to accumulate beneath layers of fabric and expectation, expose the uneasy truths that shape their understanding of hygiene. Footwear in Victorian cities endured conditions far harsher than the people who wore them, absorbing the debris of streets that were rarely dry and never truly clean. Mud mixed with coal dust, waste from passing horses, seeped into every crevice of the road, and shallow puddles collected runoff from gutters that overflowed after even the slightest rain. Shoes, often made of leather that softened quickly when wet, met all of this with each step. The surface darkened with stains that never fully dried out, and the soles carried quiet reminders of the routes women walked each day. Yet cleaning these shoes was rarely more than a brief gesture, a quick stroke of a dry cloth that shifted the dirt but never removed it. The streets outside continued to swallow anything dropped on them, and shoes simply adapted to the environment that refused to change. Women walked through these conditions with a kind of resigned steadiness, lifting their skirts just enough to avoid the deepest puddles while the hems still brushed the edges of the filth. The shoes collected more with each path crossed, deepening the layers that clung stubbornly to the leather. Nothing about these surfaces remained untouched. Mud hardened along the seams, small clumps of softened manure lodged in the grooves at the bottom, and a faint sourness rose from the mixture of dampness and decay. But the act of maintaining shoes never fit easily into daily routines already filled with work, expectations, and the endless responsibilities of the household. A cursory wipe felt sufficient, and anything beyond that required time and effort that few possessed. Inside the home, shoes were removed near doorways or in quiet corners, but even then, the residue of the streets followed their owners indoors. Stockings absorbed the dampness that seeped through leather, softened by repeated exposure to water and waste. The warmth of the foot encouraged this moisture to spread slowly, the fibres of the stockings holding it until the scent became a muted but persistent companion. Over time, the smell rose from the fabric in a steady, faint breath that settled into the small spaces of Victorian homes. Women changed their stockings less frequently than comfort might suggest, and the shoes they wore each day returned to the same corner of the house carrying traces of everywhere they had been. The relationship between shoes and daily routines remained almost ritualistic. Women retrieved them each morning, brushing off whatever loose dirt remained from the previous day, slipping their feet inside with a familiar hesitation as the lining met the skin. The leather, still holding moisture from the earlier walks, felt cool at first before warming quickly around the foot. This warmth released the mingled scent of damp leather and old streets, sinking gradually into the home-subdued atmosphere. The stockings, already carrying the imprint of previous days, absorbed the scent again, strengthening it with each hour. By the end of the day, the foot felt enclosed not only by the material of the shoe, but also by the lingering memory of the city outside. Cleaning shoes thoroughly would have required water, brushes, time, and often soap resources that were reserved for laundry, dishes, or bathing when water was already scarce. Fires needed tending to heat water, and coal was not wasted lightly. The effort demanded more than most families considered the shoes worth, and so the shoes remained only lightly tended, soft cloths lifting away excess mud while leaving behind stains that grew darker over time. The leather aged quickly, stiffening in places where dirt had dried into the surface. softening where moisture lingered too long. Women continued wearing them until the material gave way, and even then, the decision to replace them was weighed carefully. Walking through the city meant accepting the unavoidable consequences that streets imposed on every pair of shoes. The waste of hundreds of horses was layered over roads that saw little cleaning, mixing with soot from factories and ash drifting from household chimneys. The ground itself gave off a constant smell that clung stubbornly to anything touching it. Shoes could not escape this, and neither could the people who wore them. When women stopped in shops or visited acquaintances, the smell travelled with them quietly, hidden beneath layers of clothing yet always present. It rose from stockings warmed by the foot, moved lightly around the ankle, and softened only when mingled with stronger household scents. At home, when shoes were removed after a long day, the foot revealed the stronger effects of this constant exposure. Skin softened from prolonged dampness. The toes reddened or tightened slightly from the pressure of walking on uneven ground. The soles of the feet sometimes carried faint discolorations where the stocking had absorbed more than it could contain. Women cared for their feet only occasionally, rubbing them dry or dusting them with powder to mask the scent. Yet the shoes would return to their place, waiting to begin the cycle again the next morning, unchanged except for the deepening wear on their surfaces. These routines formed part of a broader truth about Victorian life that practicality overruled comfort, and appearances overshadowed the unseen. Shoes might look acceptable from a distance, their shape intact and the leather brushed lightly before stepping outside, but the reality resting within them often told a different story. The smell persisted, the dirt lingered, and the discomfort grew too familiar to question. Cleanliness, as understood then, focused on what others could observe, and shoes, though essential, inhabited a space where effort rarely matched need. The quiet neglect of footwear revealed how easily the realities of daily life slipped beneath the surface of Victorian appearances. And as these overlooked details settled into the rhythm of each day, another part of their routines emerged from the same mixture of necessity and resignation. Hidden beneath the folds of clothing and habit, further truths about their understanding of hygiene waited to be uncovered. Arsenic slipped quietly into Victorian beauty routines long before most people understood the depth of its danger, appearing in small bottles and neatly printed packets that promised refinement, pallor, and the delicate appearance associated with the higher social ranks. Shops displayed these products openly beside soaps, powders, and scented oils, treating them not as poison, but as enhancements for the complexion. Women seeking the pale, translucent skin admired in portraits and magazines accepted these offerings with calm certainty, believing that beauty required discipline and that discipline sometimes involved discomfort. The appeal of a lighter face, untouched by sunlight or blemish, outweighed the unease that might have accompanied swallowing something so bitter. And so, the ritual found its way into countless households, becoming a hidden but persistent thread woven through daily life. Each dose was taken with deliberate subtlety, often in the quiet of morning before the household stirred fully awake. The bitterness arrived first, sharp against the tongue, followed by a slight warmth that settled in the chest. Women waited patiently for that warmth to fade, convincing themselves that this sensation signaled the beginning of transformation. Over time, the skin did change. It grew paler, almost translucent under certain lighting, and this was taken as proof that the remedy worked. The compliments they received, remarks about delicacy, softness, and elegance, encouraged them to continue. In a world where appearance held extraordinary weight, the smallest sign of success prompted unwavering devotion. But transformation did not come without cost. As the skin thinned, it became increasingly vulnerable, leaving behind dry patches that cracked in the cold and reddened beneath even the gentlest touch. Blemishes appeared where the surface had weakened, forming small eruptions that resisted powders meant to conceal them. Women brushed more carefully, adjusting the amount of powder and the angle of the brush, hoping to hide the imperfections without drawing attention to the effort. Their mirrors offered a softened version of the truth, one filtered through dim light and wishful thinking. Hair, once thick and heavy, began to loosen from the scalp in small, unsettling strands. Combs collected more than they had before, carrying away pieces that never returned. Women tucked the thinning sections beneath ribbons or arranged their hair in styles that drew less attention to what had changed. They whispered faint explanations: stress, weather, routine, avoiding the deeper truth that lived inside the small bottle tucked discreetly among their toiletries. Yet the ritual continued. The desire for pale skin, for a face that signalled refinement, outweighed the fear that something irreversible was taking place beneath the surface. The effects extended beyond appearance. Fatigue settled quietly into their bodies, a heaviness that made them feel slower, thoughts feel softer at the edges. Some felt faintness rise during long afternoons, a dimness that passed only after rest. But these sensations blended seamlessly into the natural exhaustion of Victorian life, where work, social obligations, and household duties left little room to examine one's own health. Women adapted to the changes the way they adapted to corsets that restricted breath, or routines that demanded long hours. Their bodies communicated through subtle warnings, but the messages were easy to overlook when beauty remained the priority. Arsenic became part of a rhythm, its presence so intertwined with expectation that removing it felt more threatening than continuing. The market responded to this devotion with new formulas, each claiming to be gentler, more effective, or more refined. The packaging grew more elegant, disguising the harshness within. Women purchased them without hesitation, reassured by the familiar language of improvement. Even as small sores formed at the corners of the mouth or tiny blisters appeared along the jawline, the mirror's promise seemed more compelling than the body's quiet protest. Behind closed doors, the truth became harder to ignore. Skin peeled in thin, fragile layers, drifting to the tops of vanities like pale dust. Hair collected in brushes that felt heavier each day, yet the longing for transformation persisted. The face reflected in the mirror, though changing in troubling ways, still carried the pale tone associated with beauty. Women steadied themselves with the belief that discomfort meant progress, that refinement demanded sacrifice, that others had endured the same for the sake of appearance. In this fragile balance between hope and harm, the ritual sustained itself. Even the scent of these small doses became part of the routine. The faint metallic bitterness clung to the air for moments after the medicine was swallowed, lingering near the lips before dissolving. Pillows absorbed the scent of irritated skin, creating an atmosphere faintly tinged with something sharp and unfamiliar. But these signs blended into the background of daily life, overshadowed by stronger fragrances from perfumes, powders, and oils. The danger remained invisible partly because it fit so quietly into the broader landscape of Victorian beauty. By the time the cumulative effects grew severe, the routine felt too deeply embedded to question. Women faced the mirror each morning with a complicated mixture of pride and apprehension, tracing the contours of their faces as if studying both the rewards and the consequences of their choices. Arsenic, once a hopeful promise, revealed itself slowly as a burden they continued to carry. The pursuit of pale beauty revealed a willingness to risk far more than the surface could show. And as these quiet sacrifices deepened, another part of Victorian routines emerged from the same longing for control over the body. Further habits, resting in the shadows of their daily rituals, uncover even more unsettling truths about the lengths they were willing to go for appearances. Menstruation in the Victorian era unfolded quietly, hidden beneath layers of fabric and routine, managed with tools that offered far more burden than relief. Without access to modern sanitary products, women relied on folded cloth pads, simple pieces of fabric commonly referred to as rags. These pieces were shaped by hand, adjusted to fit the body as comfortably as possible, and held in place beneath multiple layers of undergarments. The material felt coarse against the skin, absorbing what it could while growing steadily heavier through the day. Yet this was the only option available to most women, a method passed down through generations and rarely discussed even among close family members. Silence surrounded the entire ritual, shaping how it was endured. Changing these clothes required privacy that many homes could not easily provide. Bedrooms were shared, washrooms were limited, and the expectation of modesty weighed heavily on every movement. Many women kept the same rag in place far longer than comfort allowed, adjusting it slightly rather than replacing it. The fear of appearing improper or drawing unwanted attention created hesitation, especially in households where every action could be observed by other family members or servants. Days of discomfort became normal, accepted as part of a monthly cycle that demanded resilience. The fabric grew damp and warm beneath layers of clothing, pressing close to the skin as women went about chores, social visits, and quiet moments at home. Some women lacked clean clothes altogether, especially during harsh winters or periods of financial strain. Laundry consumed water, heat, and soap, all of which required effort that households carefully rationed. Preparing fresh rags demanded forethought, and women who were caught unprepared often reused cloth sooner than they should have. The fabric's texture changed with each use, stiffening along the edges where dried stains remained, softening in places worn thin by repeated washings. These clothes carried the memory of every cycle, gradually altering until eventually they were too worn to keep. But until that point, they were folded and refolded, expected to serve again. At the end of each day, the used rags were hidden discreetly. Kitchens became the most practical place to wash them, partly because heated water was available there and partly because the smell of cooking masked everything else. Women rinsed the cloths as quickly as they could, scrubbing away what the fabric released and accepting what it absorbed too deeply to remove. The water darkened as it swirled, leaving faint stains along the sides of basins that were wiped clean without comment. Hands reddened from the cold, the roughness of the cloth scratching the knuckles in small, persistent strokes. Once cleaned, the rags were hung to dry in the warmest corner of the kitchen, often near the hearth where steam from pots and pans kept the air circulating. They blended into the background of household work, hidden discreetly behind towels or aprons draped along the same lines. The warmth dried the fabric unevenly, leaving patches that felt stiff when touched the next morning. Even so, these clothes returned to use as soon as they were dry enough to fold. The cycle continued, predictable and quiet, as it had for generations. Women developed subtle ways of managing discomfort. Some added extra layers of linen for security, though this restricted movement even more. Others remained still for long stretches when the rag felt especially full, shifting weight carefully to avoid leaking through the outer garments. Long skirts provided a small degree of confidence, hiding stains that occasionally escaped the cloth, but the fear of being noticed remained constant, shaping how women walked, sat, and interacted with others. Every gesture carried an underlying awareness of the body's private rhythm. The smell was another concern, one handled through powders, perfumes, and frequent adjustments. Rags held odours that lingered even after washing, especially when soap was scarce or water was not heated thoroughly. Women dusted themselves with scented powders or pressed sachets of dried herbs close to their clothing, hoping the fragrance would cover what they wished to conceal. Homes themselves carried faint traces of these routines, scents that mixed with coal smoke, cooking, and the dampness of laundry drying indoors. Despite the discomfort, menstruation remained largely absent from conversation. Girls learned from observation or from brief, whispered instructions, piecing together knowledge from what they saw and what they guessed. The clothes used, the method of folding them, the places they were stored and washed. These details became part of a private world shared quietly by women, but rarely acknowledged beyond that circle. The absence of discussion created a sense of isolation, even though nearly every woman in the household experienced the same cycle. The emotional weight of this silence settled heavily on many. The pressure to appear composed, the need to hide discomfort, the constant awareness of the cloth pressed against the skin, each aspect shaped how women experienced their own bodies. Yet they continued through their days with a practiced calm, adjusting layers of clothing and maintaining routines so seamlessly that others rarely noticed anything unusual. The rag remained hidden, tucked beneath the garments that defined Victorian modesty. Laundry days revealed the deeper truths of this routine. Piles